So let's add some content to a page and assume you have a page with the following HTML. You got basically a couple of divs and an H2, and you want to respond to any errors that happen while a user is on your page. So there is this neat .html method. Lets you retrieve the HTML currently inside the selection. Just add .html after the jQuery selection. So if you want to select and display the errors that have been returned for this div, say you're storing them in this div that has an ID of errors, so you just read the HTML that's inside that div. You can make a copy of the HTML inside a specific element and say paste it into another element. So this code would create an alert box with the text H2 errors in it. Think about that. We're going a little fast, but it's pretty straightforward. We have a jQuery selector. We have a method that returns all the HTML that's in that selection, and we're throwing it into an alert box. Just like HTML can return things, you can also set or replace the current contents inside the selection. All you have to do is put a parameter inside the parentheses for the HTML method. So again, say we're trying to build up an error message for a user. We have a couple of divs there and an H2 that's listing all our errors. So let's take that and say, there's the ID of errors, all the HTML, where before, let me go back to that slide, where before we just had an H2 with errors. We didn't have anything listed. On this next slide, we're replacing that H2 with a paragraph saying there are 4 errors in this form. So you can give meaningful feedback in a very straightforward way. Text works exactly like the method.html, but it doesn't accept tags. So say for instance we want to select that H2 tag that's inside the ID of errors, the div that has ID of errors. Here's what you would do. You would just basically say select, and if you want to replace it, put a parameter in the parentheses. And the .text method will return or set, if you use a parameter, just the text of that specific selector. Again, what we've got here is a selection. On the left-hand side, we've got the H2 that has that's a descendant of the errors ID div. You see that? H2 is a descendant or child of the div with the ID of errors. We're going to take only the text inside the H2 and change it to no errors found. And that's what it looks like. Left to right, selector, method. Now, append. You sometimes want to add things onto the end. So if you want to take this div with an ID of errors and add something onto the end of it, you would use append. It just adds HTML as the last child element of the selected element. So let's look at that. Sounds like gobbledygook, but let's look at it. Append. We've got an error selected. We're going to append a paragraph. There are 4 errors in this form. We're going to add it to the end, right before the end of the errors. So you see the errors ID div there with an H2 following it. It should sneak in right after the H2. So let's check it out. There we go. So using a parameter where we're appending something onto that div with an ID of errors adds some HTML as the last child element of that selection. And just like you can add it onto the end, you can add it to the beginning. You can kind of shoehorn it in there at the beginning by using prepend. It's just like append, but it adds HTML directly after the opening tag for the selector. So if we want to say there are 4 errors in this form, but do it before, we would prepend it. Notice we've got our message that we're prepending in the parentheses as a parameter for prepend the method, and we're targeting the div with an ID of errors again. And the result of that is what you see right there. The paragraph, there are 4 errors in this form, prepending or being inserted before, right before all the current elements in the ID with errors. There is a before and after. So instead of doing it inside an element, you would do it right before or after it. So you can add some HTML just outside of a selector or just either before or after. So let's look at that real quick. We might say add some HTML just outside of a selection. Say we have an input. An input is part of a form, and the type is text, so it's just a text box. Username is what we're the field we're working with, and you might want to, in response to some user input, add an error message after the input text, because they may have whatever validation you did, they might have not put in a name, or they might have left out the name, and you want to give them some feedback, which is really good usability. So add HTML just outside of a selection, either before the selected element's opening tag or directly after the element's closing tag. Again, this is just an example with an input type equal text from a form. We're adding username required after the username, probably in response to some validation. And there's the end result there at the bottom. So the functions in this section, whether it's HTML or text or so on, are the most popular ways of adding and altering content on a page, but they're not the only ones. You can find a whole bunch more, a whole list at that web address there. And if you want to remove a selected element, you would use .remove. And for instance, say you want to remove the error message because there weren't any errors, so you're going to remove that message. You could just use the remove command. You can also replace with. If you want to completely replace a selected element, you could do that. Very, very cool. And the thing you have to, the caveat, the thing that'll get you a little bit, is there's a difference in how your document started before you did all these manipulations and the generated source or the result of what you ended up with after you add and subtract and append and prepend and before and after and replace with. After you do all the stuff that you do, you have a bit of source code that's been generated from your JavaScript that's much different potentially than the original source code. Now, if you've installed the Web Developers Toolkit into Firefox, there is a View Source menu, and you can check out the difference between, it's kind of interesting to go to some popular websites and look at the difference between the original source and after the JavaScript got done with it. It's pretty amazing. Now, as we head into our home stretch here, we want to talk about setting and reading tag attributes, because jQuery provides several functions for manipulating a tag's class attribute, which is probably the most popular attribute for a variety of reasons. Classes, you can group a whole bunch of presentation values for elements in one class and work with just that class of elements on your page, classes being CSS classes. So If you want to add a class to a specified element, say for instance you want to add an external link class which has maybe a background graphic or something, background picture, background image, you would do it this way. Every time that jQuery finds an href attribute that starts with http:// it's going to add that class on to that element. And whatever's in that class, as far as CSS, it will display according to that CSS rule. And remove class is just the opposite of add class. You can remove classes, add classes. Very common thing to do from a user interface thing. Just one little thing as far as punctuation goes, when you're using add class and remove class, you only supply the class name. Leave out that period that you'd normally put in there. For example, I'm using here an add class of external link, which is correct. But adding a class with a period at the front is wrong. This jQuery function also takes care of issues that arise, like I said, when a tag already has a class applied to it, or the add class function doesn't eliminate old classes applied to the tag. It just adds a new class as well. So it's very smart about things. Adding multiple class names to a single tag is perfectly valid and frequently very helpful when you're designing a web page. Check out that article there if you want to know more about that technique. It's very, very common. One of the things that you do a lot is you toggle classes. You either, as a result of clicking on an item, you might add or take away a class to that element. Say for instance, you've seen these kinds of things that expand or contract as you click on a heading. It'll drop down some text. Well, that's done something like this. You add or assign an event handler for a click to the jQuery selector there. And inside the click method, what's happening there is there's an anonymous function which is giving a whole bunch of things to happen on a click. And in this instance, we're just toggling a class on the body tag. An anonymous function that's inside as a parameter to the click method. I want to stare at that one a little bit. That anonymous function looks gnarly from a punctuation standpoint, but in essence, if you think of the click method as just the parentheses, open and close parentheses, and the semicolon, then you've got the anonymous function with open and close parentheses and open and close curly braces, and then you've got the different statements inside the anonymous function.